The desert wind moved through the canyon like a whisper from the past. The sky burned gold as the sun sank behind the red cliffs. A young Apache woman named Nayeli rode her horse along the narrow trail that curved beside the edge. She had always loved riding. The rhythm of the horse's hooves was like a song she had known all her life. Her father, the tribe's chief, often said she rode like the wind itself, free, fearless, and proud. But that day, fate was waiting around a sharp turn she could not see. The trail had been weakened by heavy rain weeks before. When the horse stepped forward, the ground gave way beneath its front hooves. The animal reared, frightened, and Nayeli tried to steady it, but the earth broke apart. In one terrible moment, she was thrown down the slope. Her scream was lost in the thunder of falling rocks. When she opened her eyes again, she lay still among dust and stones. Her body hurt everywhere, but it was a strange kind of pain, sharp in her chest yet numb below her waist. She tried to move her legs, but nothing happened. Panic filled her heart. She called out for help, her voice echoing into the distance. Somewhere far above, her horse neighed before running off. Hours later, her people found her. They carried her back to the camp with tears and fear. The tribe's best healers worked for days. They used herbs, whispered prayers, and burned sage in the wind. But Nayeli's legs never moved again. She was alive, but broken in a way no one could fix. Her father stayed beside her, holding her hand each night. He promised that she would walk again, but as weeks turned into months, hope grew dim. The camp began to change. The hunters spoke in low voices when they passed her tent. The women stopped bringing her water or stories. Some whispered that she was cursed, that the spirits had turned against their chief's line. Others said her accident had angered the mountain gods. Nayeli heard every word. Each whisper cut deeper than her injury. Her father tried to defend her, but he was growing old. A drought came and sickness spread through the tribe. One by one, people left in search of better land. When the chief fell ill, the council decided to move. They told him that the girl could not travel. The journey was too hard and food was too little. If they tried to carry her, they said, more would die on the road. That night, the chief knelt beside his daughter. Tears lined the cracks of his weathered face. "My child," he said softly, "I'm sorry. I cannot fight them all." Nayeli took his hand and smiled weakly. "Father, go. The spirits will guide me." She said it to comfort him, not herself. In truth, she was terrified. At sunrise, they left. Her father looked back many times, his heart breaking with each step. When the sound of their horses faded, silence filled the world around her. She lay alone in a small hut built of branches and clay. The roof leaked. The wind blew sand through the gaps. Her only company was the distant howl of coyotes. Days passed. Her food ran out. She drank the last of her water and waited. The heat by day and the cold by night became her enemies. Sometimes she dreamed of walking again, running across the hills with her hair flying behind her. But when she woke, she could not move. She cried quietly, not wanting the desert to hear her weakness. One night a storm came. The wind tore at the roof, lightning lit the sky, and rain poured through the cracks. Nayeli lay still, her blanket soaked. She whispered a prayer to the Great Spirit to take her. "If I cannot live with my people, let me live with the stars," she said. The storm answered with thunder. She thought it was the end, but the storm passed and she was still there when dawn came. She looked at the faint light and wondered if the spirits had forgotten her. Then in the distance she heard something strange. A steady rhythm, soft at first, then louder. It was not thunder. It was not the wind. It was the sound of hooves. At first she thought it was her tribe returning. Hope made her heart race. But as the sound came closer, she realized it was only one horse. A lone rider appeared through the dust, tall in the saddle, his coat worn and his hat pulled low. He guided his horse slowly toward the hut. The stranger stopped outside. For a moment he only listened. Then he dismounted and walked to the doorway. The woman on the floor looked up with tired eyes. He saw her, thin, pale, and still, but alive. She tried to speak, but her voice broke into a whisper. The man said nothing. He looked around, saw the empty water jar, and stepped back outside. A few minutes later, he returned with his canteen and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, the water cold and sharp in her throat. He waited until she caught her breath, then placed a small piece of bread in her hand. "Who are you?" she asked weakly. He didn't answer. He only gave a slow nod, then turned toward his horse. She thought he was leaving, and fear filled her chest. But he came back carrying a blanket, laying it over her gently. Then he set to work fixing the broken roof with sticks and rope from his pack. As the sun rose higher, he built a small fire outside. The smell of smoke drifted into the hut. He cooked something simple, beans and dried meat, and fed her spoon by spoon, his expression calm and wordless. When she tried to thank him, he shook his head as if to say, "Save your strength." That night he sat outside beside the fire, sharpening a small knife. The desert was quiet except for the crackle of wood. Nayeli watched him through the doorway. He looked like a man made of silence, tall, weathered, and lonely. The flames danced on his face, showing old scars that ran across his jaw and neck. His eyes, dark and steady, stared into the fire as if remembering ghosts. Nayeli didn't know his story, but something inside her felt safe for the first time in months. The fear that had lived in her heart began to fade. She closed her eyes and slept deeply, dreaming not of death but of life again. The next morning he was still there. He brought her more water and cleaned her wounds with gentle hands. He didn't speak a word, but his actions were enough. When the sun grew hot, he made a shade of branches outside her door. He gathered herbs from the nearby hills and mixed them with water to cool her fever. For the first time since her accident, Nayeli felt the warmth of care, not from duty or pity, but from quiet kindness. She asked him his name again, and he finally spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Caleb," he said. "Just one word." Then silence again. She tried to smile. "I'm Nayeli," she said. He nodded once as if he already knew. Days turned into a slow rhythm. Caleb would ride off in the mornings and return at dusk with food or wood. He built a better roof, repaired the walls, and even carved a small bowl from a fallen branch. When he worked, Nayeli watched. He never rushed, never seemed angry or afraid. His silence was heavy but not cold. It was the kind of silence that held peace inside it. At night, the stars filled the sky. Sometimes he would hum softly, a sound almost lost in the wind. She didn't know the tune, but it soothed her. Slowly, hope began to grow inside her again, like a seed under dry soil finding the first drop of rain. She realized that she was not alone anymore. Somewhere in the wide desert where everyone else had forgotten her, one man had stopped to care. He didn't ask for thanks or stories. He just stayed. And though neither of them spoke much, something passed between them, a promise without words. As she drifted to sleep that night, Nayeli thought she saw a light flicker across the canyon like a sign from the spirits themselves. Maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't over. Maybe the desert had sent her someone not to save her body, but to remind her heart how to live again. The days after Caleb's arrival slowly changed Nayeli's world. For months, she had lived surrounded by silence that felt like death. But now the silence felt different. It was steady, peaceful, and alive. The man rarely spoke, yet every small thing he did carried meaning. He moved like someone who had known pain, who didn't need to talk about it to understand it. Every morning Caleb would rise before dawn. The first light of day would catch the brim of his hat as he fed his horse, a chestnut mare that followed him like an old friend. He would walk to the riverbed a mile away, fill his canteens with water, and bring back enough for both of them. When the wind blew cold, he built a fire and wrapped Nayeli in blankets. When the sun burned hot, he made a shade for her from stretched hides and branches. He never asked for thanks, and she never stopped feeling grateful. She began to talk to him while he worked, her voice soft at first, then stronger each day. She told him stories of her people, of how her father had once made peace between rival tribes, of how she used to race her brothers across the plains. He listened quietly, his eyes on the fire, but she could tell he was listening. Sometimes when she told something funny, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth lift in the smallest smile. At night, she would watch him sharpen his knife, polish his rifle, or mend his saddle. His hands were rough and scarred, yet every movement was careful, never wasted. One evening she asked, "You live alone, don't you?" He looked up at her for a moment, then nodded once. "Why?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke for the first time in days. "Quiet doesn't hurt," he said simply, and that was all. Those words stayed with her. She realized that his silence wasn't emptiness, it was protection. Something inside him had been broken long before he found her, but he carried it without bitterness. She saw the same loneliness in him that she saw in herself. As the days passed, Nayeli's body grew stronger. Caleb built a frame from branches and cloth that supported her back, allowing her to sit upright for longer hours. He even carved handles on the side so she could pull herself up with her arms. It wasn't easy. Her hands often trembled and her arms ached, but she refused to give up. Every time she fell, he would quietly lift her again without a word. One afternoon, when she managed to sit without his help, she looked at him and smiled proudly. "See, I can do it." Caleb gave a slow nod, but there was a softness in his eyes that said more than words could. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt since before her accident. Hope mixed with something even deeper. As weeks turned to months, they created a rhythm. He would hunt or gather during the day while she cleaned herbs, sorted supplies, or shaped small pottery bowls from the clay near the river. He began teaching her small survival skills. How to make knots, how to read clouds for rain, how to listen for coyotes or mountain lions in the distance. Her mind grew sharp again, her heart steady. Sometimes strangers passed through the desert, traders, hunters, or soldiers, but none stopped near the hut. From a distance, Caleb would watch them with quiet eyes until they disappeared. Naily noticed the way his hand sometimes hovered near his revolver when he saw other riders. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. He was a man used to danger. One night, when the fire burned low, she asked softly, "Were you a soldier?" For a moment, he didn't move. Then he nodded slowly. "A long time ago," he said. She waited, but he didn't add more. His eyes reflected the flames, distant and heavy with memory. She didn't press him. Some pains didn't need questions. The days grew colder as autumn came. Caleb made her a cloak from deer hide and lined the hut walls with straw to keep the wind out. When she shivered, he placed more wood on the fire and stayed awake until she slept. Though he never said it, his care was steady as the suns rise and fall. Sometimes he would ride off at dawn and not return until dark. Those were the hardest hours for Naily. She would stare at the horizon, afraid he might never come back. Once, when he returned late, his face was scratched and his sleeve torn. She gasped, asking what happened. He said nothing, only washed his arm in silence. But she saw dried blood on his boot. He had fought something or someone. That night, he sat by the door, cleaning his knife. She looked at him and said, "You don't have to protect me from everything." He didn't answer, but his eyes softened for a moment before turning back to the fire. Winter came slowly to the desert, turning nights colder and the stars sharper. They shared warmth from the fire, speaking little. Yet between them, silence became comfort. She learned to read his moods by the way he moved. When he stood at the doorway and looked out at the hills, she knew he was remembering something far away. When he worked on his horse's saddle for hours, she knew he was trying to quiet his thoughts. One evening, as the wind howled outside, he sat near her bed repairing a broken strap. Naily studied his face. His jaw was strong, but there was sadness behind his eyes. "You saved me," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "You were still breathing," he replied. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said. "They all left me. But you didn't." He stopped working then, staring at the floor. The firelight flickered across his face. "I know what it's like to be left," he said finally, his voice low. "That's reason enough." Then he stood and stepped outside into the cold night, leaving her to think about the pain hidden behind his few words. In the following days, Naily began trying to move more. She used her arms to drag herself to the door so she could watch the horizon. The effort exhausted her, but she refused to quit. Caleb noticed and began building something. He gathered wood, cut old wagon wheels, and shaped them with his knife. She watched curiously as he worked for days, covered in sawdust. When he finished, he brought it to her, a wooden chair with wheels. She stared at it, speechless. "You made this?" she asked. He nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "You can go outside now," he said simply. Tears filled her eyes as he lifted her gently into the chair. For the first time since her accident, she rolled herself out into the sunlight. The wind touched her face, warm and soft. She could see the wide desert stretching to the horizon, the cliffs, the dry riverbed, the endless blue sky. It felt like freedom again. Caleb stood behind her, watching quietly as she lifted her face to the sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded once, his eyes calm. "Always has been," he said. From that day, she spent every morning outside. Sometimes she watched Caleb ride across the valley. Sometimes she gathered herbs and flowers near the hut. The world felt alive again. Her heart, once filled with fear, now held peace. But as peace settled in, shadows from the past began to stir. Rumors reached distant settlements that an Apache woman thought dead was living again, healed, protected by a strange silent cowboy. Travelers whispered about it at trading posts. Some believed it was a ghost story, others believed it was real. Caleb heard the talk one evening while buying supplies. He said nothing but returned with a heavy look in his eyes. He knew the news would reach her tribe soon. Whether they came in peace or guilt, he didn't know. But he stayed calm, as he always did, his mind already preparing for whatever might come next. That night, as he sat by the fire, Nayeli spoke softly. "You could have left me many times," she said. "Why didn't you?" He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Because I couldn't." She wanted to ask more, but his tone ended the moment. Still, she knew his words carried something deeper than duty. There was a quiet bond between them now, one built not on promises or words, but on trust born from shared silence. As the wind swept through the canyon that night, both of them sat awake, watching the stars above. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time Nayeli felt something strong inside her, like a light that would never fade. She was alive, she was not forgotten, and somewhere in the silence between them hope had learned to breathe again. The days turned to weeks, and the strange peace between Nayeli and Caleb began to feel like a small world of its own, quiet, strong, and built out of trust. The sound of hammering wood, the soft roll of her new chair, and the gentle breath of wind became their music. Life had found a rhythm again, one made of patience and care. Every morning Caleb would bring fresh water and prepare food before riding out. Nayeli would spend the hours watching the sun climb over the cliffs. She had learned to move her chair with her hands, slowly rolling herself to the doorway. Sometimes she gathered herbs or flowers to dry and hang inside the hut. The smell of desert sage filled the small room, clean and comforting. In the afternoons, Caleb would return from hunting or trading, his horse tired and dusty. He never spoke about where he went, but he always came back with something useful: wood, tools, or food. Nayeli started noticing the small things he did when he thought she wasn't watching. How he repaired the roof again and again after storms, or how he sharpened his knife late into the night, his eyes lost in thought. She wanted to ask about his past, but she knew better. The man lived with ghosts, and ghosts don't like to be called by name. So instead, she told him about hers, her family, her tribe, the dances under the stars, the laughter of her brothers, the stories her father told beside the fire. Caleb would listen quietly, the lines on his face softening with every word. One evening, while the sun set in streaks of red and gold, Nayeli asked, "Do you believe people can heal without walking again?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes dark under the brim of his hat. "Healing isn't just in the legs," he said simply. "It's in the heart." Those words stayed with her long after he spoke them. When the nights grew colder, they sat closer to the fire. Nayeli practiced lifting herself, balancing with her arms. At first, her hands trembled so badly that she nearly fell each time. But Caleb never let her hit the ground. He was always there, steady, silent, patient. Each small victory became a reason to keep trying. Once, while she struggled to move from her chair to the bed, she slipped and hit the floor. The fall startled her, and she bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. Caleb knelt beside her instantly, lifting her gently back to the chair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I can't do it right." He shook his head and handed her a cloth for the blood. "You did," he said quietly. "You tried again." Then he returned to fixing the firewood like nothing had happened. But in her heart his words burned brighter than the fire. Over time her arms grew stronger. She could lift small things, move around, even help with cooking. The hut became their shared home. Caleb never said it, but he started adding small touches: an extra blanket on her bed, a wooden shelf for her herbs, a carved bowl he made from mesquite wood. One afternoon, when he returned from the canyon, he brought a surprise: a small puppy he had found shivering in the cold. It was thin and weak, with light brown fur and scared eyes. Nayeli gasped as he handed it to her. "He was alone," Caleb said. "Thought you might like company." She smiled wider than she had in months. "Then we'll call him Shadow," she said. From that day, Shadow followed her everywhere. He curled at her feet when she worked, barked softly when Caleb rode away, and wagged his tail each evening when he returned. The hut no longer felt like a place of sorrow. It was a home. But life in the desert never stayed peaceful for long. One day, a group of traders rode near the valley. Caleb spotted them from afar, his face tightening. He didn't trust strangers. When they passed close by, Naeli could hear them talking in English, rough voices full of greed. One of them pointed toward the hut and said, "Heard there's an Apache girl here. Paralyzed, they say. The cowboy's gone soft, taking care of her." The others laughed. Caleb's hand moved to his revolver, but he said nothing. He waited until they were gone, his jaw set. That night, Naeli noticed how tense he was, his eyes scanning the horizon again and again. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he replied quietly. "Some men see kindness as weakness." For several days, Caleb stayed close. He fixed the fences, sharpened tools, and watched the valley with silent vigilance. Naeli could feel the tension in him, the old soldier returning beneath the quiet man. Yet even in his caution, he was gentle with her, bringing her flowers, making sure she was safe. One morning, she woke to find him working on something again. He was carving a new handle for her chair, his movements careful and precise. "You don't have to keep fixing everything," she teased lightly. He gave her a small glance. "Some things are worth keeping strong," he said, and she didn't need to ask what he meant. Their bond deepened with each passing day. They began to understand each other without words. When she smiled, he relaxed. When he frowned, she knew something troubled him. They shared food, stories, and silence as equals. Sometimes they laughed, soft, unexpected laughter that filled the empty valley like music. One evening, as the orange glow faded behind the hills, Naeli said softly, "You've given me my life back." Caleb stared at the fire for a long moment. "You already had it," he said. "You just forgot how to hold on." Her heart tightened at his words. She wanted to tell him that he'd saved her more than once, not just her body but her spirit. Yet she didn't know how. Instead, she whispered, "You speak like someone who's been through it too." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her she was right. Days later, when he was away gathering supplies, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled and the hut shook under the rain. Naeli struggled to move her chair away from the leaking roof. Shadow barked, frightened. Lightning struck nearby, lighting the valley in white flashes. She tried to keep calm, whispering to the puppy, "He'll come back. He always comes back." When the storm finally broke, she saw him riding fast through the rain, soaked to the bone. He ran to her, checking the roof, then looked at her with worry that he rarely showed. "You're safe," he said, almost to himself. She nodded weakly. He stayed beside her all night, sitting by her bed as the rain fell outside. The next morning, he was quiet. She could see in his eyes that something had changed. The storm had stirred more than just the sky. It had brought his memories back. She wanted to ask what haunted him, but his silence was like armor she didn't want to break. As spring came, Naeli began to help more with daily tasks. She made baskets and traded them with travelers Caleb trusted. Her hands learned new strength and her heart learned joy again. The people in nearby settlements began hearing stories about the silent cowboy and the girl who couldn't walk but never gave up. And deep in the desert, the two of them built something rare, peace, built not on words but on care and respect. The loneliness that had once crushed Naeli now felt far away. When she looked at Caleb, she saw not just the man who saved her, but the one who stayed when everyone else had left. One evening, as they sat watching the stars, she said softly, "Do you ever think about leaving?" Caleb looked at her for a moment, then turned his gaze to the sky. "Sometimes," he said, "but not tonight." That simple answer was enough. Naeli smiled, her heart calm. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She had already found what most people search their whole lives for, a reason to live again. And though neither spoke of it, they both knew that something unspoken connected them now, something born from survival, kindness, and quiet understanding. It was not a dream or a promise. It was real, like the wind that moved through the valley, silent, strong, and forever. The morning sun rose slow and golden over the wide desert. The wind moved softly through the dry grass, carrying the smell of distant rain. Inside the small hut, the sound of wood crackled in the fire. Naeli sat in her wooden chair, rolling herbs between her fingers while Caleb fixed a broken stirrup outside. Their lives had fallen into a gentle rhythm that made every small thing matter. Shadow, the little brown dog, slept near her feet. When Caleb entered, wiping sweat from his brow, she smiled. "You work too much," she said playfully. He gave a quiet look and set the leather strap aside. "You talk too much," he replied, his tone dry but kind. She laughed, and even he couldn't hide a faint smile before turning back to his tools. The peace of their days felt almost timeless. But fate had begun to move again. In distant hills, people were speaking of the girl who survived when her tribe left her behind. Traders had carried the story far, and it reached the ears of the old Apache chief, Nayeli's father. When he first heard the tale, he refused to believe it. "My daughter died that night," he told them. But the trader swore he saw her himself, sitting by a fire with a silent cowboy beside her. The old chief's heart began to beat with hope and shame. He gathered a few of his men and began the long ride toward the valley he once called home. That same day, far away in the hut, Nayeli was feeling stronger than ever. She could move her chair farther now, even up the small hill behind the house. Caleb often helped her to the top at sunrise so she could watch the light touch the red rocks. The desert had once felt endless and cruel, but now it felt like part of her. When the first riders appeared on the horizon that evening, she didn't notice them at first. Caleb did. His hand froze where it rested on his saddle. He narrowed his eyes, watching the dust trail rise behind the approaching horses. Something about their movement, slow, careful, watchful, told him they weren't just travelers. He went inside quietly. "Riders coming," he said. Nayeli looked up surprised. "Maybe traders?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. "No, they ride with purpose." She wheeled herself to the doorway and looked out. As the riders came closer, she felt something familiar, something deep in her bones. The lead rider sat tall and proud, though his hair was now streaked with gray. Her breath caught. "Father," she whispered. When the riders stopped near the hut, the old chief dismounted slowly. His eyes searched the small clearing until they fell on her. His face went pale, then trembled with emotion. "Nayeli," he said, his voice breaking. She couldn't speak for a moment. Then she called out, "Father, I'm here." The men behind him gasped softly, whispering in disbelief. The chief stepped forward, falling to his knees beside her chair. His hand shook as he reached for her face. "You are alive," he whispered again and again, as if saying it would make it real. Tears filled his eyes and dropped into the dust. Caleb stood a few steps away, silent as always, his hat lowered. He gave them space, watching quietly. Nayeli's heart felt heavy and light at once. She had dreamed of this moment for months, but now it felt unreal. Her father held her hands tightly. "I thought I lost you," he said. "They said the spirits took you." She smiled faintly. "The spirits didn't. He found me." She looked toward Caleb. The chief followed her gaze and saw the quiet cowboy standing by his horse, dust and sunlight covering him like an old cloak. "Who is he?" her father asked. "The one who saved you?" Nayeli nodded. "Yes, his name is Caleb. He gave me water when I had none. He built this chair, this house. He kept me alive." The old man turned to Caleb and rose slowly. He looked at the cowboy with both pride and confusion. "You cared for my daughter when her own people failed her. For that I owe you more than I can repay." Caleb met his eyes but said nothing. After a long silence, he gave a small nod. "She saved herself," he said quietly. "I only gave her a reason." The chief's men murmured among themselves, some ashamed, others in awe. They had left her once, believing her doomed. Now they saw her alive, stronger than ever, with a light in her eyes they didn't recognize. As the sun lowered, the chief's group set up camp nearby. They offered food and gifts, but Caleb stayed apart, tending his horse. Nayeli could sense his unease. That night, when the stars came out, she rolled her chair near the fire where he sat sharpening his knife. "They're my people," she said softly. "But I don't know if I still belong to them." He didn't look up. "You belong wherever you choose," he said. She smiled sadly. "You always say things like that, short but heavy." He put down the knife and looked at her. "The truth doesn't need many words." For a moment they sat in silence, the firelight dancing between them. Then she asked quietly, "Will you leave when they do?" Caleb's face stayed calm, but his eyes darkened a little. "Maybe," he said after a while. "Your people need you." "I needed you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And you stayed?" He didn't answer. He only looked at the fire until she rolled away, her heart aching with the thought of losing him. The next morning her father asked her to return to the tribe. "They will welcome you," he said. "We need your spirit, my daughter. The people must see that hope can rise from pain." Nayeli looked toward Caleb, who stood by the corral. "And him?" she asked. The chief frowned slightly. "He is a good man, but his path is not ours. The cowboy lives for the road. You belong to your people, she said nothing. All day she thought about it. The wind blew across the valley, whispering between them all. Caleb kept working quietly, pretending not to notice the glances from the Apache men. Some watched him with respect, others with suspicion. That night, as the tribe prepared to leave, Caleb saddled his horse. Nayeli saw him tightening the straps, his movements slow and deliberate. She wheeled closer. "You're leaving," she said softly. He nodded once. "Your father's right. You have people now. You don't need me anymore." Her throat tightened. "That's not true," she whispered. "You think I lived because you found me, but I lived because you stayed." He hesitated, looking at her for a long moment. The light of the campfire reflected in his eyes. "You were never cursed, Nayeli," he said gently. "You were always stronger than you knew." Then he turned away and mounted his horse. Her father stepped forward to thank him again, but Caleb only tipped his hat. Without another word, he turned his horse toward the open desert. The sound of his hooves faded into the night, slow and steady until there was only silence. Nayeli sat there watching the darkness swallow him. Her heart felt hollow, like part of her had ridden away too. Her father came beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "He is a man of the wind," he said softly. "Such souls cannot be kept." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know," she said, "but I'll never forget." The next morning when the tribe rode home, she turned once more to look at the horizon. The sky was wide and endless, painted with pale gold light. Somewhere out there, she knew Caleb was still riding, silent as always, but alive under the same sky. The people of her tribe welcomed her return with awe. They called her the woman who rose again. Children gathered to hear her speak. She taught them about courage and kindness and how strength wasn't in walking, but in standing strong inside. And every night, when the stars shone bright over the desert, Nayeli looked toward the west and listened to the wind. Sometimes when it moved through the canyons just right, it sounded like a horse's gallop, steady, distant, familiar. And she would smile, knowing that the man who once saved her life was still out there somewhere, watching over her in silence. The seasons turned slowly one after another, and the years carried Nayeli's story across the land. The girl who was once left behind became a symbol of hope for her people. Her father grew proud again, though his heart never forgot the shame of abandoning her. Under her guidance, the tribe changed. They built homes stronger than before, treated the weak with care, and learned that no life was too broken to hold value. Nayeli could not walk, but she stood taller than most through her courage. She had built a small hut near the edge of the village where she welcomed anyone who was sick, hurt, or tired of life. She used herbs she had learned to mix from her time alone in the desert, and her words healed where medicine could not. People said she carried the spirit of peace itself. They called her the woman who rose again. Children would often gather around her at sunset, their small faces glowing in the orange light. They asked her to tell the story of the silent cowboy, the stranger who rode from nowhere and saved her. She never told the tale with sadness. Instead, she spoke with a soft smile and a distant look in her eyes, as if she could still see him in the horizon. She would begin the same way every time. "I was left to die in a world that forgot me. But the desert did not forget. It sent me a man who spoke few words but carried kindness in his silence." The children listened in wonder, their eyes wide as she described how he gave her water, built her chair, and taught her to live again. When they asked if he ever came back, she would shake her head gently. "Some people don't need to come back," she would say. "They never really leave." Years passed and her father's hair turned white. Before he died, he called her to his tent. He took her hands in his and said, "You are the strength of our people now. Promise me you will keep their hearts kind," she promised. When he closed his eyes for the last time, the tribe mourned him, but they also looked to her for wisdom. Under her care, the village grew peaceful. She taught them to trade fairly, to plant seeds where the soil could still hold life, and to help travelers who lost their way. And though she was no longer young, her spirit remained bright. Sometimes when the nights were quiet, she would sit by her doorway staring at the moonlit valley. Shadow, now old and gray, would rest beside her chair. The stars above shimmered like the eyes of the past. She would close her eyes and hear again the sound of hooves fading into the desert wind. Every spring she saw a single rider in the distance, a man on a chestnut horse, always too far to see clearly. The tribe believed it was just a trader or a spirit passing by, but Nayeli knew. Her heart always felt it before her eyes could see. The rider never came close, only stopped for a while on the ridge before disappearing again into the horizon. She would smile quietly, whispering, "Still watching over me, aren't you, cowboy?" Her people often wondered why she stayed unmarried. Many good men had asked for her hand over the years out of love and respect. But she always refused gently. "My heart is already spoken for," she would say. They didn't question her after that. One cold evening, when the first snow touched the high cliffs, Nayeli sat by the fire with a group of travelers who had come seeking rest. They were from the town beyond the desert and carried tales from far places. One of them mentioned a man, a cowboy who rode alone, helping strangers, never asking for pay or fame. "They say he speaks little," the traveler said, "but he saves lives wherever he goes. Folks call him the Silent Rider." Nayeli's heart stirred. She asked softly, "What does he look like?" The traveler thought for a moment. "Tall, with eyes that look older than his face. Rides a chestnut horse. Keeps a scarf around his neck like he's hiding old scars." Her hands trembled slightly as she smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "That's him." The traveler went on talking, but Nayeli didn't hear much after that. Her thoughts drifted far away across the desert that once held her prison and her salvation. She pictured Caleb riding through the wind, still quiet, still kind, leaving trails of mercy behind him. That night she couldn't sleep. She wheeled her chair to the doorway and watched the moon rise. The valley was silver and still. Somewhere a coyote cried in the distance. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "Wherever you are, I hope the road is gentle to you." As the years passed, her hair turned white, and her hands grew thin, but her heart stayed strong. The tribe built her a larger hut with wide windows so she could see the horizon from her bed. Each morning she looked out waiting, not with sadness but with peace. She had long stopped hoping for his return. She simply felt comfort knowing he still walked the same earth. One morning, when the air was cool and soft with dawn, a young boy came running from the edge of the valley shouting, "A rider! A rider on the ridge!" The people gathered to see. Far away, just as the sun rose, they saw the figure of a man on horseback, standing against the light. He didn't move closer. He just sat there watching, like a shadow carved into the sky. Nayeli's heart knew before her eyes did. Tears filled her eyes, not from sorrow but from gratitude. She lifted her hand slowly toward the horizon and whispered, "Thank you." Then, as the people watched, the rider turned his horse and disappeared into the morning sun. After that day, no one ever saw him again. But every time the wind blew through the canyons, it carried the faint sound of hooves, steady and distant. The people said it was the spirit of the Silent Rider, still guarding the valley where kindness had once bloomed. Years later, when Nayeli's time came, she left the world as gently as she had lived. The tribe buried her beneath the same tree where Caleb had once tied his horse long ago. Beside her grave they placed the wooden chair he had built, its wheels still strong after all the years. The chief's descendants told her story to every new generation, passing it down like a sacred song, and so her name lived on, not as a woman who was broken, but as one who rose again. And his name, too, became a legend. Travelers spoke of a cowboy who appeared when all hope was lost, a man who healed without words, then vanished into the dust. Some said he was just a man. Others swore he was sent by the spirits. No one ever found his grave or his trail or the horse he rode. But sometimes, when the moon hung low and the night wind carried the scent of rain, the people swore they could hear it, the steady sound of hooves echoing faintly through the desert. And those who listened closely said it wasn't just a horse they heard. It was the heart of a promise kept long ago, between a girl who refused to die and a man who refused to let her. And even as the world changed, and the desert grew silent again, their story remained. It became a tale told by firelight, a lesson for those who lost hope, that kindness can save lives, that silence can speak louder than words, and that sometimes the strongest love is the one that asks for nothing in return. Far beyond the years, when the last ember of the fire fades and the stars return to their watch, one might still feel it, the soft rhythm of hooves on sand, moving gently across the horizon, carrying the memory of a cowboy who never forgot, and the woman whose courage turned sorrow into legend.